brilliant ideas, powered by Hyundai Motor.
The idea for me very early on was I want to use the body as a found object. Here is this thing that I actually happen to inhabit. Can I treat that as a found object? I didn't ever want to make another body. It seemed to me absurd, you know. I've got one already. Let's use it as the tool, as the subject, as the material. Furthermore, I could work on it from the inside without worrying about what it looks like particularly, but concentrating on what it feels like.
He has taken his own body and he has extended it. He has floated, and I love that playfulness.
There are very few artists who are as inventive with a single form.
Community and art, individual bodies, groups of bodies, and that interaction between these pieces of his work is what gives it a kind of coherence.
He has used every aspect of being in skin with bones and tried to understand what that feels like and how to communicate it.
And naturally, for people who experience the work, one feels called into a meditative, if not worshipful state.
I've often used that metaphor of acupuncture. Sculpture can somehow just activate. It's not about occupying or possessing or controlling a space. It's just about activating a space, making it more alive.
For over 40 years, British sculptor Antony Gormley's work has focused on what it feels like to inhabit the human body. From intimate sculptures cast in his own form, collaborative community projects, to architectural explorations on a grand scale, his work can be seen around the world, on shorelines and clifftops, tower blocks and in cathedrals. Influenced by the dialogue between art and the spiritual, anthropology and science, he asks questions about our place in the world.
With sculpture, it exists in time, it resists time, it displaces space, it is not easily assimilated. But if you engage with it, it can provide a place of reflexivity. And I think that's, for me anyway, that's its primary value.
Antony Gormley's had a busy year, with a major public commission and several new exhibitions that not only look back at his early work, but also showcase a new visual language in relation to the body. He's perhaps best known for his high-profile public commissions, his most famous being the monumental Angel of the North. Wider than a jumbo jet and as tall as a 5-storey building, it's near Gateshead in the north of England.
This staggeringly popular piece of work that is now almost a symbol of the country itself. I was in a bookshop in Vancouver Airport not long ago and saw that this guidebook to the British Isles had the Angel of the North as its cover image. Oh, it's an astonishing thing, that.
It's a transitional object on a very large scale. I was lucky enough to arrive at a time when there were still the skills that fed the great shipyards of the Northeast, and say to people, can we make an imaginative object that is going to be a transitional object between the industrial and the information age for this community that has been told that it has no purpose anymore, that all of the things that made it a community no longer have any value.
He's anxious about, agitated about, angry about what's going on in the world in which he lives, in which we live, and that is feeding him. And yet his work doesn't in any obvious way take that on directly. He takes it on in a subtle way, but it's always taking it on because he's always, I think, he's just about always wondering what is the place of the human in this complicated thing called society.
You could say this is a totemic object for a community in crisis.
He's made works which speak to everyone, and The Angel of the North is the perfect expression of that.
Born in London in 1950, Gormley's Roman Catholic upbringing, together with explorations of other cultures and religions, was to have a profound effect upon his approach to making art.
In 1969, I went to India. It was fantastic. Waking up in Howrah Station in Calcutta and seeing bodies everywhere, and seeing the bullock carts and the bicycles and the rickshaws kind of weaving their way through these shell-like, very vulnerable, abstract sculptures. Immediately coming back from India, the first works that I made were very much kind of remakings of that experience of seeing people sleeping on the streets, and that notion that here was an intimate architecture that, expressed the place of the body without describing it.
Gormley had always been interested in the unseeable space that the body occupies. One of the first works in which he experimented with his own form was Bed, created in 1981.
He'd made a self-portrait by eating his own profile out of mother's pride and creating a silhouette out of the bread. And the bread was significant. He's looking at nourishment, he's looking at inside the body, outside the body.
Bed begins this idea of acknowledging the body as a void space of potential. Yeah, it wasn't long after that I made the first lead body case work, which was called Mould.
Whilst other artists of his generation were experimenting with abstraction, Antony Gormley focused on the human body.
We are given, in a sense, a mould that we can pour our own feelings, our own emotions, our own sense of being in the world into.
At the same time as focusing on our bodies, he focuses on the environment around us. And the most beautiful work in Liverpool is Out at Sea, where a number of figures, like a painting by Caspar David Friedrich, look out towards the horizon, and we look out with them.
We're so used to seeing art in the very manicured conditions in the art gallery. It's just fantastic when you put work in the real world.
Place and environment have been crucial to some of Antony Gormley's most successful works, and over the past few decades, he's taken the figure and explored its place in the world.
If we look at the history of classical statuary, it was gods, generals, politicians.
What is this man doing, placing large replicas of his own body all over the landscape? But that line of attack completely fails to understand what he's doing, inviting us to think about where we place ourselves in relation to the body, to the place, to our own self.
It is like meeting an everyman, and I think that's why it speaks to such a wide audience.
It isn't actually just about people reacting to it. It's that feeling, here is this made thing that's come from industry, and then you see it out there, how this thing reacts to the weather.
He's chosen a very narrow métier, and yet every time I encounter one, I'm surprised by it.
From Buddhist philosophy to the ever-expanding universe or studies in anthropology, Antony Gormley's inspirations are many and varied. This endless curiosity is no more apparent than in a recent commission called Chord, created for the mathematics and science departments of MIT. Drawing on the geometric shapes found in nature, a 40-foot-high spiral column of polyhedrons connects the floor of the building's central staircase to the skylight.
I find in the language of physics an extraordinary metaphor for our state. Part of the idea of this work was in the context of this extraordinary institution, this groundbreaking idea of what a community of mind could be in terms of thinking about human futures, and indeed all futures. In its spelling C-O-R-D, as opposed to what it is spelt, C-H-O-R-D, it suggests something about the umbilical cord, about attachment, about the relationship of one human body to another.
Look at Antony's preoccupation, for example, with particle physics, theoretical physics. I think it is a limitless curiosity and actually a kind of acceptance of mystery.
It's an invitation for the natural choreography of the building and the human life within it to become more conscious of itself.
It's a very open, inviting piece. It enhances a sense of community because, you know, you're very likely to run into somebody looking at the piece.
To have a piece of art in a natural light space is to bring a level of humanity and a level of emotion to this campus that you don't see in other spaces.
At the end of the 1980s, Gormley began a series of new works that, rather than using his own individual form, focused on collective bodies. In 1994, he was awarded the Turner Prize for Field, a series of installations made in collaboration with different communities.
The full field of the mass of humanity staring at us in an apparent helpless alienation. And we know that each of these figures was made by a sort of anonymous hand, made by the people.
The first thing that we might do as babies is to just grasp a bit of mud from the playground or the park and squash it and try and make it into something. So he's appealing to a very primary impulse, something quite atavistic.
And I think it's a big insight into the way in which Antony is anthropological, and his imagination and his sense of art is linked to the tribal.
Rather than being an individual or creating your own individualistic statement, that you can make something which is part of a commonality, that there's a kind of sense of both agency but also togetherness.
That may be my anthropology coming through, but I just think the collective engagement in making, as it were, imaginative things, well, you know, it's alive and well.
Over the years, Field has been taken to other communities around the world, from China to Brazil and beyond. Gormley has also made sculpture using other people's bodies. One particularly remarkable project was inside Australia, involving the inhabitants of an outpost called Menzies in Western Australia.
We had the support of people who would normally be deeply resistant, completely bewildered, even scornful.
Just got to stand with your feet parallel. You know it. Okay. How do you do? I'm Anthony. Anthony. Yeah. Peter. Hi there, Peter.
He got them to take off their clothes, strip naked. It's a wonderful metaphor. It's what they had to do, but it's metaphorically exactly what he required. And he created a community of people in cast steel, a battered-looking material that he used, and they are beautiful beyond belief. At the very end of the project, the Aboriginal of this little town of Menzies said this was them, and they saw in these figures on the lake their ancestors, their own essence.
Can art, in collective space, act as a focus for people's hopes and fears? Well, the answer is yes, it can.
Perhaps Gormley's most radical work to date involving members of the public was One Another. For Trafalgar Square's fourth plinth, instead of making an object, he created a living art piece in which visitors were invited to occupy the space.
He gave over the platform entirely to the people of Britain and asked them each to take up an invitation to be on the plinth for an hour.
But it's in a place which is all about grandeur. And around this plinth, around Trafalgar Square, are all the symbols of ruthless and magnificent and self-important British history. And yet, on the plinth is a repudiation of that.
These works are us, and we bring to them a range of experience and emotion, and we project them onto the works.
I thought there was something profoundly democratizing and liberating and joyful that is at the heart of what it is to be in a community of real living people.
Can we use the privileged space of the statue to think about ourselves? Us now as a living portrait of Britain. And I suppose a bit like the Angel of the North, I won't do that again.
Over the course of his career, Antony Gormley has continually experimented with the language of the body in space. Where once he used plaster moulds, today 3D computer scans have allowed him to experiment with the body form, pushing and expanding its shape.
In his more recent works, when he's using very strict geometries, you get the relation with architectonic sensibility, with geometric abstraction, and these have taken him in a completely new and different direction.
Still finding new techniques and mediums to work with, at Alan Christier Gallery in London, he's installing a new exhibition of printed works on paper, including small aquatints and etchings, large-scale wood blocks and body prints.
I mean, he strips off his clothes, throws himself in a lot of crude oil, and then literally imprints himself on the paper. In a way, it's the most kind of visceral form of printmaking because it's your body on the paper. Some of them are ginormous and others are tiny, but it's all part of the same thing.
We could put the one that's on the end there. They're not representations. They are traces of real surfaces. But of course I want them to be metaphoric. Of course I want them to be a ground onto which you project your feelings. The use of crude oil that's been mixed with petroleum jelly and then linseed oil, you know, in different ways, these are all bodily fluids, but of the planet. The principal dialogue is between these wood blocks that are about a human space that uses the language of architecture or the idea of containment, the idea of a multicellular box, and puts that in dialogue with the idea of a lived moment of a body.
It's all about his figure in the end, his body. And it's all about materials that are kind of essential to human existence.
In recent years, Antony Gormley's work reflects a growing interest in the relationship between the body and the built environment. This is reflected in a major new exhibition, Fit, at White Cube Gallery, Bermondsey in London. Arranged into a labyrinth of 15 chambers, visitors are faced with a choice of passage through unique spaces, each offering different dramatic encounters.
It's a summation of a lot of the concerns that have been, you know, evolving in the work for ages. Vitality and consciousness are incarnated in the body, and that's the first body, but the body then lives in architecture, in a room. That's a second body. And I'm very interested in that idea of replacing the first body with the language of the second.
Gormley's studies in Buddhism and meditation have shaped much of his work. But it was early childhood experiences that first had a fundamental impact on his thinking about the body.
I was sent upstairs to have a rest immediately after lunch. Keen to please, I would lie there still with my eyes firmly shut. It would induce this feeling of panic, claustrophobia, of being cooked alive. what I discovered was that if you stayed in it long enough, your experience of this very bright, claustrophobic, hot, matchbox-like space just behind your eyes would change, and it would get cooler and darker and bigger. Eventually, you would be in this space, floating in a cool, dark infinity. What started as an imposition ended up as this place of freedom. And then I guess I reconnected with that space later. This work is a 40-foot-long tunnel in human form that you're invited to look at as an object, but also enter as a space. You will walk down this narrow passage towards ever greater darkness. It's obviously a metaphoric journey that you will go on. And then at some point, you'll presumably want to turn around, and you then have a very different experience as you walk out towards the light. That's the most extreme example of the art being an invitation for a certain kind of confrontation with yourself. You'll walk towards your own shadow, you'll walk towards a dead end, which is totally dark. I'm wanting to play with scale, so the central space you actually can't get into because it's full of hundreds of small sculptures. This is the sleeping field. And that is, in a way, the outside world miniaturized. From a distance, it looks like urban landscape. These reclining forms that are all sleeping people. And it makes you feel huge as you look down on this landscape that is, in a way, a meditation of our condition now.
He wants to make the city seriously playful. I think people equate the playful with the kind of light-hearted, but play can be very, very serious, and I think that's the kind of play that the city works are engaged in.
In a time in which the majority of our species lives within a constructed world, what can we say about human nature in a time of the mass urbanization of humankind?
Over the past 4 decades, Antony Gormley has continually found surprising and thought-provoking ways of experiencing the human form in space. Through his engagement with his own body and with those of others, he raises key issues about the relationship between art, society, and the environment.
I think Antony Gormley has reinvented figurative art.
He's the antithesis of the isolated, angry artist. Antony's practice is very much carried out in the public realm, and you can't do that if you can't connect with people.
Antony is not making for posterity. I think he's making, in some ways, for eternity.
I used to think that I made the work. I don't anymore. The work makes us, and it's not just me. What we've got to do is attend to it and listen to what it's telling us and then follow its direction. And I wouldn't dream of predicting where we might go next.
Brilliant ideas, powered by Hyundai Motor.